Hey everyone, welcome to this third talk on the Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism. This is part 3 and it is on the Empress, L'Imperatrice. So for those who haven't seen part 2 or part 1 is public. So if you just click on the channel, you'll be able to find part 1, and part 2 is for patrons only. So if you really get something out of this talk and you want to follow along this series, half of them are for patrons only. So it's just a $5 a month patron, and the link will be in the description below. But let's begin on part 3, the Empress. So this is the third major arcana, the Empress, and the author, as is sort of typical so far of each card, he opens with a quotation from the Gospel. In this case, a quote, a section from the Gospel of Luke. "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." That's Luke 1:38. And this quote plays a big role in this card. This idea of undertaking something that is very specific to the Lord, in relation to the Lord, in relation to a unification between human and divine wills, and in relation to this relationship between the above and below, in specific in relation to this idea of being, I am the handmaid of the Lord. In a relation, something is being enacted in relation to the Lord. So this card is in two words, is really the arcanum of sacred magic, which is, a little bit dubious, I guess, for some people who might be watching this with a more of a traditionally religious background. But by the end, this all comes to a sort of a realization where the terminology that's used in these more classical mystical circles, outside of a very traditional religiosity, actually sort of folds in, and you realize that we're talking about very much the same thing. So, once that word magic's brought into play with certain things, it conjures up all kinds of ideas, and sort of seems somewhat suspicious in certain senses. But the author here does unfold it in such a sense that you begin to understand there's different types of magic and there's different understandings, and there's, of course, two sides to everything in that sense. So there are 3 kinds of magic, says the author. Magic where the magician is the instrument of divine power, which is sacred magic, so the instrument of a divine power, very important. Magic where the magician himself is the source of the magical operation, which is personal magic. And lastly, magic where the magician is the instrument of elemental forces or of other unconscious forces, sorcery. We don't really talk too much about sorcery in this talk, really. We're talking about this difference between sacred and personal magic and what the key differences is between them. This card, as emphasized, is really emphasized by the author as between the second and fourth, and of course that will seem obvious, but he's saying it's very important that it's a continuation, and the relationship to the second card comes in quite a bit in this talk. We don't touch too much on the fourth, but just to keep that in mind. So, unlike the previous card, we actually get into the imagery of this card, L'Imperatrice, very quickly. And so, following on from this idea of magic, the author states in a very quick and not actually very heavy-handed definition, it's probably the best one of the best definitions of magic that you'll get. All magic is putting into practice of the fact that the subtle rules the dense. That is, the subtle rules the dense. Force, matter, consciousness, force, and the superconscious or divine consciousness. These are all sort of levels or relationships of this materiality, if you want to put it that way, of the subtle ruling the dense. Subtle energies, subtle energies is the best way to put it, but subtle ruling the dense, which will expand and open in this chat. For those of you that are familiar with various other mystical pathways, even St. Thomas Aquinas in relation to the levels, Jacob's ladder, the ray of creation, however you want to understand this, the above to the below, the levels, the planes of being, the idea of a subtlety and a density of matter as we descend down. So the Empress represents the rulership of the divine. Okay, so really we really are talking about and around these planes of being. Traditional Christians would understand it as God, through to angels, or if you're Orthodox, through to seraphim and cherubim, and then all these levels of angels, and then through to man, and then animals, and then plants, and then minerals and rocks, right? You have these levels of being that go down and down and down, subtle to the dense. And in a certain way, you can think about the above coming to the below as often as the dense to below, drawing down the layers from above. But however, the Empress very distinctly represents the fact that the above, the divine, that those higher levels, and of course the highest level, God, is the ruler, is superior. And a very, very key word, it's this superiority that gives that divine power a legitimacy, okay, in the sense of almost a monarchical legitimacy, a cosmic monarchical legitimacy of magic, of power, of spirituality. So we look at the card, L'Imperatrice, the third card, the third arcanum. Her crown, her scepter, and her shield, or with a coat of arms on it. And these represent the three instruments of the exercise of this power. So for those that are just listening, I will describe it. Really, what we have is the Empress here, a woman clothed in sort of royal robes, sat down in a throne, holding in her right arm to our left a shield with a coat of arms, which is an eagle painted on it. And in her left arm, she is holding a scepter, and she is wearing a crown on her head. And also, just to note, but this comes in a little bit later, the throne, the back of the throne, it clearly has a back, and the top and the back of the throne almost look like angelic wings. But each of these will be unfolded as we go along. So, these represent the three instruments of the exercise of this magical power, this sacred magic that we're talking about. The crowned head is the power of the divine over consciousness. It is the legitimacy. It is the rulership, the authority from above. The right arm is consciousness over force, and the left arm is energy over matter. It's the hierarchy of forces and their respective powers, the subtle to the dense. Okay. That subtlety of the divine that comes in those moments of silence that we've spoken about. So the crown thus represents divine authorization and legitimacy of power from above. The only type of magic which for the author is not usurpatory, to usurp the throne. Okay, the crown is the symbol which legitimizes what is coming down. Okay, it's not malevolent, it's not malicious, it's not coming from some person, it's not coming from some demon, it's not coming from some other unconscious force. It is from above, from God, and the crown, almost in the sense of that divine right, when we think of monarchy in like the Joseph de Maistre sense, a divine right as symbolized by the crown, which legitimizes it. The scepter negates impotence. It is the means, it is the tool to the means of how things are being done. And the shield implies aim, with a motto which isn't on the card, and the author doesn't actually expand on where he gets this from, with a motto which reads, liberation in order to ascend. So, and then to continue this imagery, the throne symbolizes this inalienable place specifically of magic in spiritual and natural life. She, as a symbolic whole, is representative of the whole of magic in the world. We have the legitimacy, the means, the aim, and the place of magic in the world. Now, the author takes us on a tour of these symbols, as you can imagine, as a way to open up this card. So, the crown of the Empress, and here we're already harking back to the previous card, the High Priestess, when we remember that she had a three-layered tiara, talking about those planes of being once again. The crown of the Empress differs from the tiara in that it has two levels instead of three. Therefore, her bearing, the bearing of the Empress, is on two planes, whereas with the Gnosis of the previous card, as we saw in the last talk, carries revelation through three planes. For those, very, very briefly, for those that either aren't patrons or missed that talk, the three planes of the previous card were to do with a divine communication. So as something comes down from the divine, it has to go through someone who is open enough to the divine to be able to actually hear it, a saint, a prophet, etc. That person then has to deal with it in their own way and has to be able to articulate it to somebody else, and thus is a communication. And then you have these 3 levels, and the final level, which is in a way a 4th level, but the High Priestess, the previous card, doesn't get to that, but the 4th level in a way is that person finally taking their understanding, which has come down from the divine, and putting it in a book, writing it down, communicating it, the Gospels. So magic is crowned, okay, since her task is the sublimation of nature, as indicated by the shield or of the coat of arms with the eagle in flight, that the Empress holds instead of a book. Okay, so you have an aim instead of a book. The book is this of the previous card. The High Priestess was holding a book, which is to do with communication. It's to do with spreading the word. The shield is to do with an aim, an eagle in flight. We've spoken here very briefly. The author talks about the task of sublimation of nature. And the author actually takes this from another author called Josephine Pelledan, who defined magic as the art of the sublimation of man. And this is the aim of magic, if the sublimation of man is understood as human nature. So sublimation, to sublimate, to pass or cause, to pass directly from solid to the vapor state. That is really, once again, harking back to the subtle ruling the dense, this below nature of man, not really a base nature, but you could think of it as that, the below nature of man sublimating itself to the subtler energies of the above. And just to bring in a metaphor which has really worked well for me in relation to this, Gurdjieff is really great with this in terms of subtle energies, and he thinks of man. If you think of man as a machine, and this is done very well in a book called The Making of Man by Kenneth Walker. If you think of man as quite literally a machine, and as he's on that below level, of sins, of desires, of temptations, of all the muck and dirt of the world below, his machine and all the cogs in it are filled with moss, they're filled with rust, they're filled with dirt. And the task to bring these subtle energies is to clear this all out so that the machine, when it's working fully, when man is working fully and has fully sublimated his nature to the divine, he can, in this metaphor of a machine, once he's cleared out all that dirt, the purpose of the machine is to more accessibly and easily have a connection with those above energies, those subtle energies. Once again, I'm not hugely fond of the words energy, power, and this sort of thing coming in, because they have somewhat been usurped by the New Age movement. And as soon as people start talking about the energies coming down, I do get fairly suspicious. But this is the language that the author's using, so I will use it. So from this idea of the subtle ruling the dense, we turn to the shield. And note, of course, that it is that the author does say ruling the dense. There isn't really a choice. And the choice, if you're trying to get the dense to rule, to do it the other way, to negate that relationship, it's always going to be false. There's a legitimacy in relation to the above. So we turn to the shield. We turn to the soaring eagle of the shield and its aim. And the author says here, because happiness is raised to the level of an ideal, freed from the negative aspects of oneself and of things, this is the sole triumph of this world. So it's not happiness in this very material sense, freed from the negative aspects of oneself. Think back to what I said there, just about clearing out all the dirt in the machine, clearing out all your negative emotions, clearing out your temptations, clearing out everything in you which is stopping you from allowing and fully opening yourself to that subtle energy which is coming in, the subtle voice which is coming in those moments of contemplative silence. We often find in those moments of contemplative silence things coming in, static on the line which try and ruin it, and it's that dirt in the machine that you need to clear away and clear out. So, on page 34 to 35, the author states, the application of the strengthened human will to accelerate the evolution of the living forces of nature, which is preceded by another definition. Magic is the science of love, and I believe these two actually come from Pappus, and these magic is the science of love, we can think back to the almost a strange irony in here in relation to how magic is commonly understood in our contemporary culture. I mean, we can think of Harry Potter, or we can think of any film where magic is, you have the wand, and it's this very personal, like I say the thing, and the wand does it all, and it's all very individual, and it's all very me. To say magic is the science of love is to think back to those previous talks, and to think back to the fact that love is superior to all, and love is an emanation from God. Therefore, magic is this science of just communication with God and being able to utter and utilize and open oneself to the once again, the energies of God, the subtle energies of God, in a greater and greater way, and not use them in the sense of like, I'm going to use them for me, but to be open to them so they can be spread, because love can't be captured in that way. You just open yourself to it more and are able to use that sort of magic throughout the world. And in this way, the scepter is really the final part of our symbolic puzzle here. Once again, I'll state, it represents the means by which the aim, which is the shield of magic, is attained. And so the shield is what, the aim. The scepter is how, and the crown is by what right. Oddly, the author here, he suddenly turns, he doesn't do much on the shield, but he says, from this idea of by the crown and by what right, the author is very key on this question of legitimacy. And I think in a certain sense, for those that maybe look at this book and they go, meditations on the tarot, Christian Hermeticism, and are of a more strict religious tradition, and I'm probably trying to hold this at arm's length, this is really where the author comes in. And you can see it's clear that he has gone through the ringer of spiritual study and come out the other end with all this knowledge and realized that Christianity is the truth all along, and by what right? So by what right? The crown. The question of legitimacy regarding magic, that is to say, the notion of, he's tackling this huge question that everyone has, I think, that keeps it at arm's length for those of a traditional religious disposition, which is the notion of the supremacy that one gains via the study of magical exercises, right? So this is one of the big suspicions, I think, of so-called occult, spiritual, and mystical study is, well, hang on, aren't these people studying all these exercises, these techniques, in a way to sort of just better themselves as a sort of a self-supremacy? And, by what right do they have that? Where's the legitimacy? And this, for the author, is a very, very serious question. And as we were speaking of it specifically, Christian Hermeticism is a form of magic in keeping with the, he's trying to find this a form of magic in keeping with the sincere Christian understanding and the reserve of divine grace that Christians have. In short, the question he's asking with regards to this legitimacy is, are these magical aspirations of the individual unwholesome and contrary to human nature and the Christian religion? And such doubts and objections are obviously well-founded, of course, especially in relation to the Christian understanding of humility and of pride, of not being prideful, of being humble. And really, this idea of you going off, you're studying all these magical things to sort of better yourself, or maybe even try, it appears to be for someone becoming supreme, there's sort of anathema to the understanding of humility and pride, and the notion of the church as the church body, the communion. Okay. However, the author asked, even though such questions are well-founded, they equally lead us to ask if there is such a form of this magic, as it is out there, and it is a thing, which is free from such doubts. That is to say, is there such a thing as legitimate magic from a moral, from a religious, and from a medical point of view? And as the author's point of departure, he takes these words from Acts in the New Testament. This is Acts 9:32-34. Now as Peter went here and there among them all, he came down also to the saints that lived at Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden for 8 years and was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Rise and make your bed. And immediately he rose. This act of spiritual healing is legitimate beyond doubt, beyond all doubt. It's in the Gospels, it's enacted by Peter, and it's done in the name of Jesus Christ. It's an act of pure charity, which is in the name of Christ. It is perfect morally, theologically, and medically. The healing itself is the aim. The word based on essence of Jesus Christ is the means. And the source, the crown, was Christ himself. Jesus Christ heals you. It is definitely legitimate. And for the author, these three things are such that render sacred magic legitimate, and they are found and understood via the three symbols of the Empress. Now, an objection here would be that this isn't magic. This is a miracle, i.e. it is the action of God, and man is nothing here. Now, the author asks, well, why then? And I'm speaking for the author here. I'm not settled on this myself, so I'll speak for the author. The author asks, well, if this is so, that it's just a miracle, well, why then was Peter there? Was he there for nothing? Why is this action not accomplished directly, without Peter? The author argues that Peter's presence, his voice, were needed for the healing to take place. But why is this? This is a big question and a problem of deep, deep meditation for the author, because really we're talking about the question of why is it that God doesn't simply intervene without what might be called spiritual interlocutors, apostles, prophets, or even, we're speaking of the incarnation itself. Why did God become, for the author, God-man? Why did God become man in Christ in order to accomplish the work of divine magic? Why is there this need for this redemption? Why does God just not intervene directly from above? And for the author, this must happen because, and this is on page 56, the work of the redemption, being that of love, requires the perfect union in love of two wills, distinct and free. Divine will and human will, the above and the below, and there has to be that choice. For the author, then, miracles require two united wills. They are not manifestations of an all-powerful will ordaining, but they're due to a new power born between the unification of the divine and the human will, between the unification of the above and the below. And so the author believes one should speak of magic when it is the case of a miracle. For there is a magus, and his will is essential for the realization of the miracle. This does not, however, mean it was personal, for it has to have been divine, for Peter could not have done anything without being unified with that of the divine. And this takes us to the meaning of the double-layered crown. It is to be doubly happy, to serve that which is above, which is then rendered to that which is below. It's the legitimacy of the crown. But it has to be the double layer. It has to come from above in the notion of this crown to the below, thus making the act legitimate. The magus is the link between the above and below. For the author, such an understanding holds even for the sacraments, right? For these are such that they are already decided upon by the above, but a priest is needed for the individual operations here below. And of course, the priest goes through a massive, years-long process to become ordained and become that legitimate sort of heir in relation to the tradition of the apostles to be able to enact these things on the below. And there is, of course, this sort of chain of legitimacy. And so we've seen here the true order of things, from the above to the receiver, put into operation by the scepter, the means, and then rendered to the below, the legitimacy from the above to the below. And this really takes us to a brilliant and extremely articulate definition of what we think of when we think of bad magic, actually. Because what of the reverse, the author asks? What of usurpatory magic? Magic to usurp, arriving in the reverse order. Here we would find the magician who studies the occult and makes the decision of when and how to put it into practice. Remember, it's not spontaneous like the miracle the divine that comes from above. It's not spontaneous. This is the magician saying, right, I want to do it here and now via my means, personal. So here, much like with the inversion of science and divine from the earlier talk, with divine comes from above down to the below, and then we begin from the divine revelation. We begin from our understanding of revelation, and that knowledge thus allows us to ascend. What science does, it begins from the below and believes in a false ascension from its own facts, that it's taken from the below and not from the above. We see this once again, right? We see that someone who is working in reverse here is the soul master of their actions from the below, thus meaning that the soul will, acting as the director of operations from below, is the human will. This type of magic, often titled arbitrary or personal magic, is by far the most dangerous, as agreed by Eliphas Levi and Pappus. To begin without a master, whether a master from below who has had genuine contact from the above, or the master, God, is a grand fault. And for the only will that is driving it is the human will. And we can't really say what that is as developed without God's will. Okay, super dangerous. Don't do it. So here we return to sacred magic and the symbol of the scepter of the Empress. To look at the scepter, it is comprised of three parts: a cross, a globe, and a staff. The scepter is narrower below and thicker where it supports the globe, which is surmounted by a cross. The globe is divided into two by a belt, forming two cups, one upside down, supporting the cross and turned downwards, the below, and one turned upwards, supported by the staff, the above. The joining of these two is symbolic of the expression of realization is founded within the legitimacy of the crown, right? The two potential wills of the crown become actual in the scepter, the means. The cup surmounted by the cross is the divine will, and the cup supported by the staff is the human will. The power results from an influx from the cross, the above, descending down into the below, the above into the below, as one unified in two wills. Or, and this is on page 60, the holy blood from above concentrates itself and becomes a drop of human blood by the human word and action. And one would be absolutely right here in thinking of the Eucharist, the author says. And this is what we're talking about here, really. For it is there, and there only, that the power of sacred magic resides. For in this power has to be this act of sincerity between the divine and human will. As one takes in the body and blood of Christ, the greater the intensity, strangely, of one's sincerity, the greater one opens oneself to the sincerity of that quote-unquote symbolic act. Though it isn't symbolic, it is symbol come real. That is the true presence. The greater the potency from the act from above, the greater that unification of the two wills, the human will, which is being sincere in the reception of this, and the divine will, which is, allowing this. And so this all comes to the question of its aim and brings us to the shield and a long quotation from the Gospel of Luke. And this is Luke 7:21-22. Jesus cured many of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many that were blind he bestowed sight, and he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them." This, and on page 61, this is the aim of sacred magic. It is nothing other than the give the freedom to see, to hear, to walk, to live, to follow an ideal and be truly oneself. But you notice it's to be oneself after the legitimacy, after God. The author goes here on a digression regarding evil, stating that the devil and demons' only weapon is temptation, whereas the possession is this engendering of a being which overcomes one, and one becomes a slave of their own creation. We notice there the freedom to be truly oneself. In this notion of possession, of course, you aren't yourself. You're possessed by something other, something that might have been created by a temptation, by a desire. And so the author states that one really needs to be truly aware, once again back to that metaphor of the dirty machine, needs to be truly aware of their own perversities, such inner perverse tendencies, the author states, which lead to atomic bombs, to war, to hate. And so man, for the author, is not bound by the conventions of either heaven nor hell, and so can go on beyond the framework of these laws and arbitrarily develop these sort of inner gods, egregores rendered from collective perversity. However, the author deals more of these in Arcanum 15. So, to the throne. The throne of the Empress represents the role and the whole of sacred magic in the world. It is the domains of nature, mineral, animal, plant, human realms. Mineral, plant, animal, and human realms, and the role of magic within them. It is such a domain, complete with this sacred magic, which shall, for the author, liberate man from his fallen nature. For the throne has a back, which strongly represents two wings, though historic analysis of this card is debated on this point. Either way, such wings, says the author, could represent the liberatory notion regarding sacred magic, against the constraints of personal magic, in opposition to hypnosis, to awaken the free will, but it's a will, once again, under God. It is for the author to become a voluntary servant, meaning to say, a friend. To bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Galatians 6:2. The saints did not project their forces onto others, but they took from them that which was unhealthy. In this sense, sacred magic can do nothing else but serve the good. a choice confirmed by revelation or otherwise via direct revelation, confirmed by experience. There are gestures relating to these practices, of course, many of which are far from being kept secret, kneeling, standing, prostrating. And to reveal or share these is not wrong. These are common. We all know many and many of the practices of prayer and kneeling, etc. However, to bastardize them, to remove them from their context of their magical operation, to bring them to a lower plane, to make the sacred profane, this is the true abuse. For when one thinks of the Mass, the operation works only in the context of the sacred Mass by a person who alone is legitimately authorized to do so, a priest. Not secrecy, but context and legitimacy of the operant. And yet such mysteries are not only protected by secrecy, for there are very few mysteries which are truly secret in and of themselves now. Most mysteries are even publicly available and accessible. And yet they hide themselves in plain sight. They hide themselves in the twilight of symbols, says the author. Accessible only to those who make the effort, those who meditate, contemplate, and enter into, back to that first card, into the silent dialogue with the mystery at hand. And it is this struggle found in this working out, the contemplation of the mysteries, the return to the unificatory state prior to the fall, which has always been the struggle of mankind, the only struggle of mankind. Because after the fall, toil and struggle, that was when they began to exist. Toil, struggle, suffering only began to exist as states after the fall, all reserved in part for the practice of gnosis, says the author. And so it's only since man has been, when we were in the Garden of Eden, we always inherently had that unificatory will. We were one with God. We walked side by side with God. And it is after the fall that these wills split. And so the author is saying, ever since the fall, the only struggle of man has been this struggle to return to that unification of the two wills. All actions relating to the process of change, metamorphosis, and transformation, for in the unification with the divine will, one is whole, unless there's no possibility of... Sorry, let me just go over that again. The process of change, transformation, metamorphosis are all to do with this struggle and to do with this voluntary suffering in relation to the Lord and this return to the unification of the two wills. And so when you're unified with God in this unification of the divine and the human will, you are one, and thus there is no possibility of change. It's perfection. And yet post-fall, with the development and reality of struggle, the only way of being is a return to unification with the divine will afforded to us by this reality of toil and struggle and transformation. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's John 14:6. Firstly, this is a summation, says the author of the first three tarot: mystical spontaneity, revealed truth, and of transformation and sacred magic. We turn to the tree of life, an effort accessible only to those who can say, to return right to the beginning, behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word. To hope that there are those still working to put the effort and concentration into retaining the eternal flame sent from above as an act of healing, that the miraculous still exists. And the author says, yes, this miraculous does exist. The miracles are here, not as some gigantically external thing, but as an effect onto the lower planes of existence, the above rendering to the below. And so we return to the difference between the descension of the divine to man, from the above to the below, which the man then uses, which is truly ascension for man, and the ascension of knowledge from man to the false above, truly descension, because the man is just caught in a loop of the below. The difference between their construction as guided from the above as a blossoming, and a destruction guided from below, known as a progression. When we think of the tree of life, the author asks us to think of the quotation, lest he put forth his hand and take also from the tree of life. Genesis 3:22. He asks us to emphasize the idea of putting forth our hands. This is a will to power, underlying the scientific attitude. This is prevented in the Bible by the flaming sword of the Garden of Eden, out of respect for the tree of knowledge. Someone jabbing their hand forward and trying to grab some knowledge, taking it. The Hermetic attitude is not one of putting forth one's hand out of greed, power, and gain, but one of opening one's heart, opening one's mind to that which one is given as granted from the above, if they are so open to it in moments of silence, contemplation, meditation, if one only applies the concentration and effort needed to see and to hear. The flaming sword of Eden then is essentially a yes or a no. It invites and encourages all those worthy, but forbids those unworthy, those who seek only destruction via the knowledge, the taking. It is benediction, which seeks to forbid those who seek to possess knowledge, as opposed to being open to that which they are granted by God's will. Page 69, nature is wounded but not destroyed. It is the job of those with open hearts to construct and repair. One cannot take a branch from the tree of life. You can't just snap a branch off and take it. This is to separate that knowledge from its root. For in doing so, it ceases to be sacred. You've just possessed this thing and it becomes a personal acquisition, a possession. I'm going to take this piece of knowledge and use it myself. This is the human will, once again, all on its own. This is that arbitrary, reversed, negated magic that we spoke about. In this possession, magic becomes ceremonial, a possessed symbol of humanity, a human magic with a human will, bereft from that root, from the divine will. Technological science is the continuation of this impulse, the possession or acquisition of knowledge converted into a ceremonial appendage for the progression of the human will. Not afforded, but taken. All severed from its root, from God's will, from the above. To receive, to act with openness, is to return to our discussion regarding sincerity, to be sincere and humble, and thus not to possess. And what exactly is it to be sincere? Faith is the experience of divine breath, hope is the experience of divine light, and love is the experience of divine fire. Page 71. There is no authentic and sincere religious life without faith, hope, and love. But there is no faith, hope, and love without mystical experience, or what is the same thing, without grace. 71. The three ways or stages of traditional mysticism, purification, illumination, and union, are those of the experience of divine breath or faith, divine light or hope, divine fire or love. 71. Love, hope, and faith are the source of this sincerity needed for the beginning of that communication of the divine and the divine unification between the divine and the human will. Love, hope, and faith, the source of sincerity. Love, hope, and faith, the source of sincerity, the source of openness, found within the inner silence. Thus they are the foundation for the approach to the tree, the approach which is not possessive, but silently, sincerely inquisitive, and seeks not to acquire, but to open, to love, and to heal. In this manner, and almost cheaply, faith then is the source of magic in the manner of sacred magic, that which is contemplated as given from the above, and thus rendered as a form of healing unto and throughout the below. This is found in the aforementioned unification of the two wills, human and divine. And so as to return to the card of the Empress, we return to the card as the stability and the foundation of sacred magic being life as it was prior to the fall, a return to that form of unification we once had with the Lord. The tree of life for the author is of mysticism, gnosis, and magic, the unification of the two wills and the stability of that in the legitimacy from the above, the means via the scepter, the aim of the eagle, and the place of it in the world, in the throne. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to this talk once again. This is number 3. Number 4 will be the next one for patrons only. So if you have enjoyed this, please if you've really enjoyed this, please sign up to the Patreon. It's only $5 a month, and it's the only thing which keeps the podcast going indefinitely. It's the only way the podcast keeps going, and the only way I can keep doing these things. I don't do adverts. So please, if you enjoyed these I'm trying to get these out once a week. And if you haven't seen the first one, it is on the channel, and I will create a playlist for all of these to be in there. But once again, thank you all very much, and I'll see you in the next talk.